Hello, my name is Robyn, and today my classmate Shilik and I are going to give an overview of Saba Mahmood's article, Religious Freedom, the Minority Question, and Geopolitics in the Middle East. This is a very interesting but kind of complicated article because it involves sort of three big topics and kind of how they're interconnected. Those topics are religious liberty, the concept of minorities or minority, and power politics within the region. So let's jump into it. So I'm going to go over the main ideas in this article and how Saba Mahmood kind of presents his argument, and then Shilik will go over the case study we're going to introduce, as well as talking about how this relates to course content. So in this article, it starts off by kind of asking us to reinterpret how we perceive the right of religious freedom. For many of us, especially in Western liberal democracies, we may think that the right to religious freedom is an inherently good thing. It's symbolic of coexistence and peace. That probably represents a secure state. But Mahmood presents that despite claims of religious neutrality, liberal secular states are frequently involved in regulating religious affairs, and they do so in accordance with a strong urge for protecting individual liberties. Now, I think it's important to distinguish that it's not that either of these are inherently good or bad, but it's that there's kind of a darker side to both individual liberties and both the concept of religious freedom. While it is common to understand the idea of religious liberty as an individual right, there is a far less recognized element of religious liberty, which Mahmood argues it has been used as a tool for modern governance and its role in maintaining the geopolitical international system. With these relationships are the unequally weighted sovereignties between Western and non-Western states. Mahmood argues that this emergence of the concept of religious liberty has participated in the creation of something that is called the minority problem. He says that his point is that there's no account of religious liberty in colonial and post-colonial societies that is adequate without analyzing the constitutive effects that the inequality of geopolitical power has on its concept and practice. So, yeah. So, since the signing of the Peace of Westphalia, there has been the creation of religious liberty and its twin concept, state sovereignty. What's really important there is the idea that the signing of Westphalia conceived both of these ideas. They're born together. State sovereignty and religious liberty, they almost couldn't really be separated after that. The European perspective directly connects the religious with the political, and therefore religion with territory. Mahmood references the relationship between European forces and the Ottoman Empire, and this was around the time that the Ottoman Empire was declining, arguing that since the signing of the Peace of Westphalia, these two groups had different understandings of what religious liberty really meant, and religious liberty was directly connected to statehood and nation states. Of this time, which was 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s, empires that were once very strong and very strong political entities were dissolving and they were becoming weaker. And there was a new international political order that was acquired at the Versailles Peace Conference, and it was a political order based on the concept of nation states. Nation state would lead to what Mahmood calls the minority problem. Nation state is an important idea here because the nation state does not necessarily recognize multiple kind of parallel communities that are distinct by way of ethnicity or religion or sect. It seeks to represent the people, or more so the individual, and so maybe there's a bit of erasure there of unique communities. So next I'm going to be covering the idea of what is the minority question or the minority problem. This is a huge part of this article. So Mahmood takes a lot of time to iterate the importance of understanding the history of the term minority and what it's meant in the international community and kind of in a global sense. After the signing of the Peace of Westphalia, we had a new international order that kind of saw things in terms of territories and boundaries, and less so in terms of identities, I guess, if that makes sense. That is how geopolitics were working at the time. It's become the new international order, which is focused on states interacting with other states. And of those states, not all are equal. Western states kind of have a more privileged stance in the global arena than non-Western states. And within those states, there are people that are not all equal. And this kind of leads to the minority. The term minority was built sort of on a fundamental tension. Rather than recognizing people as different but equal, it kind of others the smaller group, and it kind of casts them aside as the other, which creates perceived threat from the majority and creates this perceived threat of a challenge towards national unity. Another thing that Mahmood kind of references as a contributing factor to the minority question is that all of this kind of reinforces the idea of nationhood being defined by, kind of simplistic factors such as who is the majority sect, who is the majority dialect of language. Like, these are kind of simplistic things that even to this day are contested on how you kind of define nationhood. So, Mahmood kind of argues that this can actually sort of reinforce very nationalist mentalities. So yeah, this institutionalized what it meant to be a minority, this shift in the international community, and the US becoming a leading superpower after World War II, especially after World War II, and then becoming deeply involved in the Middle East, would sort of just rub salt in the wound, because if there is one thing the US promoted, it was that individual liberties, which kind of ties back to the religious freedom or religious liberty concept, and the power of the individual rather than the power of a community, especially back then. And so that does kind of erase the idea of distinct but equal communities within one region. All right, so to wrap up, the final part of Mahmood's article is a case study that essentially reinforces all of the arguments he made above, because he uses a very good example of the Coptic Christians in Egypt. They are a minority group in Egypt that effectively displays the issues and limitations to how the international community defines and restricts minorities. So Mahmood uses the example of the Coptic Christians in Egypt. They are a minority group in Egypt that effectively displays the issues and limits to how the international community defines and kind of restricts minorities. Coptic Christians proudly distinguish themselves from other Christian communities in the Middle East because of their repeated resistance to European offers of protection, and for fully participating in the anti-colonial movement that overthrew British rule in Egypt. This shows the complexity and challenges to this new international approach of religious liberties and the minority question. So a few key points to wrap up. Neither the concept nor the practice of religious liberty has been a universal signifier of stability. It is dependent on the context of power relations that exists in. No account of religious liberty in colonial power or post-colonial societies is adequate without analyzing the constitutive effects that the inequality of geopolitical power has on concept and practice. And finally, while certain post-colonial religious minorities may see the international law and the way that European influence has affected the minority question as a form of protection from discrimination, this protection is also what makes them increasingly vulnerable. And so that kind of just relates back to what I was saying earlier, as this article seeks to prove that there is an inherent dark side with these topics.
So this part of the presentation is going to now focus on how the article relates to course content, and I'm going to be splitting it up into 3 different parts. The first connection to the course content is that Saba Mahmood's article describes a common theme amongst the geopolitics of the Middle East and North Africa, and that is identity politics. As Saba mentioned in her article, the terms majority and minority came to serve as a constitutional device in 1919 for resolving differences that the ideology of nationalism sought to eradicate, eliminate, or assimilate. In the case of Coptic Christians in Egypt, which is the case study that we'll use for this presentation, they represent 8 to 12% of the population in Egypt. Yet, there's actually a strong divide between the Coptic Christians and the Muslims in Egypt. For centuries, the Copts held a negative connotation from Western and non-Western powers, and this was no different for the population in Egypt. Strongly resisting the idea that they'd be called a minority in Egypt, the Coptic Christians want to be just like everybody else, but the divide amongst Muslims and the Coptic Christians in Egypt led to a rise in violence towards the religious minority group. Even after non-secular protests against President Mubarak in 2011, many Coptic churches and communities experienced vandalism and a lot of violence in Egypt. The second connection I'll be making to the course content is a connection to international relations. Saba Mahmood explains that a key figure to the right to religious liberty is the figure of the minority in Middle Eastern history that has served as a site for the articulation and exercise of European power, or aka as a means of keeping European interests within the region. Western powers have repeatedly intervened within the geopolitics of the Middle East. Mahmood outlines how it is important to understand that European attempts to influence weaker states to accept provisions for religious freedoms for minorities is inadequate because of the inequalities within the foreign affairs of the Middle East. The third and last connection I'll be making to the course content is going to be about religion. Saba explains in her article that despite religious minorities being at risk within their nation states, religion can actually be a helpful tactic within geopolitics and foreign affairs, but this can also increase risks. For example, while certain post-colonial religious minorities can claim international law to protect themselves from discrimination, and not all religious minorities can, this protection also leaves them more vulnerable. In the case of the Coptic Christians in Egypt, we actually see that the Coptic Christians repeatedly distinguish themselves from other Christian communities in the Middle East and pride themselves for rejecting any European offers of protection. Furthermore, I think this is interesting to relate to what everyone was saying in class the other day, that despite religious minorities being called minorities, sometimes being a minority doesn't necessarily cause oppression or persecution or violence. And we see this in cases where the majority religion of a nation state is not reflected within the government. So the government may be ruled by a minority religion. And in cases like this, states can empower religious minorities within the country. And we've seen this in countries like Syria, for example, with the minor sect ruling the government and a disproportionate amount of government positions being filled by Alawites, despite the majority of the country being Sunni Islam. I think this article is helpful in understanding the regional dynamics of the Middle East and North Africa. It offers insight on the navigation of religious minorities within the region. Saba does a great job of illustrating the links between religious freedom, the minority question, and geopolitics. She explains that no account of religious liberty in colonial and post-colonial societies is adequate without analyzing the constitutive effects that the inequality of geopolitical power has on its concept and practice. In more simple terms, she's trying to say that religious liberties within the Middle East are insufficient if you do not consider the inequalities amongst the geopolitics of the region. The right to religious liberty promises to allow the ability to choose one's religious freely without coercion by the state, church, or so on, and the creation of a polity or constitution in which one's economic, civil, legal, or political status is unaffected by one's religious beliefs. In colonial and post-colonial Middle East, these religious liberties are difficult to achieve because they are A. European influence in ideas in non-Western lands, and B. Violent and discriminatory acts are widespread within the region where governments do not enforce protection. However, we're going to be watching a clip on Saba Mahmood and her discourse on religious freedom, and she's going to discuss how sometimes being a minority allows you to actually have international protection and both freedom and unfreedom at the same time as a religious minority. And she's going to be able to further explain her ideas about religious freedom, the minority question, and geopolitics, and how to apply it to the regional dynamics of the Middle East. So yeah.
While it is common to conceive of religious liberty as an individual human right, a far less recognized aspect of religious liberty is its long-standing use as a technology of modern governance and its role in the maintenance of a geopolitical and international legal order. In so much as the inequality between Western and non-Western sovereignty is a structural feature of the modern geopolitical order, at least since the 18th century, the establishment of the principle of religious liberty, as well as its ongoing exercise in non-Western countries, continues to be shaped by this inequality. My paper today is an exploration of this neglected dimension of the right to religious liberty. Focusing on the Middle East, I analyze how the discourse on religious freedom from its inception has been intertwined with the exercise first of Western Christendom, Christian power, and later secular power, and how its subsequent institutionalization through national and international laws continues to be beholden to this history. A key figure in this alternative genealogy of the right to religious liberty is the figure of the minority that has served as a site for the articulation and justification for the exercise of European power over non-European lands and sovereignties. As I will show, from the 16th century onwards, the discourse on religious liberty in the Middle East has been intertwined with European projects of extending protections to non-Europe Muslim minorities, primarily Christian, as a means of securing European interests in the region. The recent adoption of the International Religious Freedom Act by the US Congress in 1998, which authorizes the US President to persecute violations of religious liberty globally, particularly of Christian minorities, is only the most recent example in this long-standing pattern. As I will argue, such a historical project cannot simply be understood as an instrumentalization of religious minorities for geopolitical ends. Instead, one must ask as to how the very concept of religious minority, its space of problematization, is indebted to this history. Viewed from this perspective, religious minorities do not simply signify a demographic entity that are accorded a space of freedom and immunity by the institutionalization of religious liberty, but are also produced through the process of the legal codification of this principle. One of the key questions that guides this talk is how the discourse on religious liberty has participated in the production of the minority problem in international law, and how this problem has unfolded in the history of the modern Middle East. It is clear that any discussion of the persecution of religious minorities in our world today is a vexed enterprise. Difficult questions are at stake in such an undertaking. On the one hand, there is no doubt that violent and discriminatory attacks against religious and ethnic minorities are widespread in the world today. Whether it is the organized pogroms against the Muslim minority in India and earlier in Bosnia, or the persecution of Baha'is in Iran and Christians in Egypt and Nigeria. It is clear that in the last several decades, religious and ethnic minorities have come under brutal and sometimes genocidal attacks in a manner that seemed inconceivable at the end of the Second World War. On the other hand, one cannot treat the fact of religious persecution of minorities as simply a sign of the increased intolerance of contemporary societies, or a characteristic of certain religions or cultures. Rather, one must also think critically about conditions of secular liberal governance, both national and international, that define what counts as an act of religious persecution. In pondering interreligious strife today, I want to suggest the relevant question is not so much what inhibits the realization of religious freedom, as if religious freedom were an ahistorical and universally valid good, but how the national and international regulation and protection of religious minorities makes specific notions of freedom and unfreedom possible and imaginable.
I hope you enjoyed that video and hope it helped you learn a little bit more about Saba Mahmood's perspective on religious liberty, minorities, and geopolitics in the Middle East. As we come to an end for our presentation, I'd like to thank you guys for listening, but we'd also like to conclude with 2 discussion questions for the class, and we'll post them up at the end of this video. Thanks!